In the fading light of a cold November evening in 1860, the telegraph wires hummed with news that would shatter a nation. Across the vast American landscape, from the marble halls of Washington to the dusty streets of southern plantations, and the smoke-choked factories of the North, a single name echoed like distant thunder: Abraham Lincoln. Farmers paused their plows, merchants closed their ledgers, and enslaved men and women listened in shadowed cabins as whispers carried the weight of an uncertain tomorrow. The United States, that bold experiment born from revolution and forged in the fires of independence, now trembled on the edge of dissolution. No drums yet beat, no rifles cracked, yet the air itself felt heavier, charged with a silence that spoke of fractures too deep to mend. The collapse did not announce itself with chaos or cannon fire. It began quietly, in the hearts of a people divided by soil, by labor, and by a moral wound that had festered for generations. This is the story of the United States before the Civil War, a republic unraveling from within while the world watched in stunned fascination. The young republic had risen from the ashes of colonial rebellion, its founders crafting a constitution that balanced power between states and federal authority with careful, almost fragile precision. By the 1820s, the nation stretched from the Atlantic's crashing waves to the Mississippi's muddy currents, fueled by the Louisiana Purchase and the relentless march of manifest destiny. Canals carved through wilderness, steamboats churned the rivers, and railroads began their iron web across the land, carrying cotton bales southward and manufactured goods northward. Yet beneath this surface of progress lay a profound asymmetry. The North pulsed with the rhythm of industry, its cities alive with the clatter of looms and the shouts of immigrant laborers, drawn by promises of opportunity. In contrast, the South remained anchored to the earth, its economy a vast green sea of cotton, tobacco, and rice, where the labor of enslaved millions turned seeds into wealth that filled the holds of ships bound for Europe. Daily life in these regions moved to different drums, one mechanical and urgent, the other seasonal and rooted in tradition, yet both claimed the same flag and the same founding ideals of liberty. In northern mill towns, dawn broke with the shrill whistle of factories, where entire families rose before first light to tend machines that never slept. Children as young as 8 learned the clack and wear of spindles, their small hands nimble amid the constant hum of progress, while women balanced wage work with household duties in cramped tenements, smelling of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. Immigrants from Ireland and Germany crowded the docks, their accents mixing with the steady cadence of English as they built the infrastructure of a new economy. Sundays brought church bells and modest gatherings, but conversations increasingly turned to reform, to abolitionist pamphlets passed hand to hand, and to the moral stain of slavery that many viewed as incompatible with the nation's promise. Meanwhile, in the South, life unfolded under vast skies over endless fields, where the creak of wagon wheels and the distant call of overseers marked the hours. Plantation houses stood white and columned, their porches shaded by live oaks draped in Spanish moss, while slave quarters huddled nearby in simple wooden rows, their evenings filled with the low murmur of spirituals sung in defiance of exhaustion. White families enjoyed the rhythms of harvest balls and fox hunts, their wealth measured in bales and human chattel, yet even here a quiet unease lingered in the glances exchanged between master and enslaved, a tension no amount of prosperity could fully silence. The early warning signs were invisible to most, buried in the very documents that had birthed the Union. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, delegates had compromised on slavery with the 3/5 clause in the fugitive slave provision, papering over a fundamental contradiction between the declaration that all men were created equal and the reality of bondage. By 1820, when Missouri sought statehood, the balance tipped visibly for the first time. Northern lawmakers recoiled at the prospect of another slave state tilting congressional power, while Southern voices warned that restriction meant economic strangulation. The Missouri Compromise drew an arbitrary line across the continent at 36 degrees 30 minutes, admitting Missouri as slave and Maine as free, yet it resolved nothing. It merely postponed the reckoning, a legislative bandage over a wound that continued to suppurate. Few at the time grasped its fragility, but in the decades that followed, the line became a symbol of division rather than unity, a quiet admission that the Union's foundation rested on shifting sands of sectional interest. As the 1830s unfolded, the warnings grew louder, though still dismissed by many as mere political theater. South Carolina's nullification crisis of 1832 saw the state declare federal tariffs unconstitutional and threaten secession, a direct challenge to national authority rooted in the defense of its cotton economy. President Andrew Jackson stared down the rebellion with military force, but the underlying grievance remained. The South's fear that Northern industrial might would one day dictate terms to Southern agrarian life. Then came the Mexican-American War of 1846, a conflict sold as destiny fulfilled but which added vast new territories to the Republic, reigniting the slavery question with ferocious intensity. Gold rushes in California and waves of settlers poured westward, yet every new acre raised the same intractable debate. Would these lands be worked by free labor or by chains? The Compromise of 1850 attempted to soothe the fever, admitting California as free, strengthening the fugitive slave law, and organizing the rest under popular sovereignty. For a fleeting moment, church bells rang and newspapers proclaimed peace, but the law's enforcement brought federal marshals, dragging escaped men and women back into bondage through northern streets, turning ordinary citizens into unwilling participants in the machinery of oppression and eroding trust on both sides. By the mid-1850s, the fabric of compromise had frayed beyond repair. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 repealed the Missouri Line entirely, allowing settlers in those territories to vote on slavery themselves, a doctrine called popular sovereignty that sounded democratic but unleashed chaos. Pro-slavery forces from Missouri streamed across the border, clashing with free soil emigrants in a prelude to civil strife known as Bleeding Kansas. Farms burned, elections were rigged with armed intimidation, and bodies lay in the tall grass as neighbors turned on neighbors. The violence spilled into Congress itself when a Southern representative caned a Northern senator nearly to death on the Senate floor, the crack of the cane echoing through the chamber like a harbinger of worse to come. Newspapers in Boston and Charleston printed competing versions of truth, inflaming passions until even moderate voices struggled to be heard above the din. The collapse did not begin with chaos, but it was accelerating now, fed by a press that thrived on outrage and a public increasingly unwilling to yield an inch. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in 1857 delivered what many viewed as a mortal blow to any remaining hope of peaceful resolution. Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had lived in free territories, sued for his freedom, only for Chief Justice Roger Taney to rule that African Americans could never be citizens and that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. The decision, intended to settle the issue once and for all, instead inflamed it. Northerners saw it as judicial overreach protecting an immoral institution, while Southerners hailed it as vindication of their constitutional rights. In the wake of the ruling, abolitionist fervor surged, with figures like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin already circulating like a moral firebrand. Yet the most dramatic spark came in October 1859 at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where the radical abolitionist John Brown and his small band of followers seized a federal arsenal in a doomed bid to spark a slave uprising. Brown's raid ended in swift defeat and his execution, but not before his calm demeanor on the gallows and his prophetic letters from prison convinced many in the North that he was a martyr and many in the South that Northerners were fanatics bent on their destruction. The air grew thick with dread. Families in border states began hiding weapons, and political rallies turned into armed standoffs. The presidential election of 1860 crystallized every fracture into a single, irreversible fracture point. 4 candidates fractured the vote along sectional lines, but when Lincoln, the Republican from Illinois who had vowed to contain slavery's expansion, won without a single Southern electoral vote, the South interpreted it as an existential declaration of war on their way of life. In Charleston and Atlanta, church bells tolled not in celebration but in mourning, while militia companies drilled openly in town squares. Southern newspapers published editorials warning of Northern aggression and economic ruin, their ink still wet as legislatures convened in emergency sessions. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late for dialogue. Key decisions made over decades, each one a calculated gamble to preserve unity, had instead eroded the very ground on which that unity stood. The pressures of cotton prices, moral absolutism, territorial ambition, and political ambition had converged into a perfect storm that no compromise could now deflect. Secession began not with a bang, but with a quiet scrape of pens across official parchment. South Carolina led the way in December 1860, its ordinance of secession read aloud in a packed hall as crowds outside cheered and wept in equal measure. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana followed in rapid succession, their conventions echoing with declarations that the Union had become a threat to their sovereignty and their peculiar institution. By February 1861, the Confederate States of America had formed in Montgomery, electing Jefferson Davis as president in a ceremony marked by solemn hymns and defiant flags. The moment the system began to fail was visible in the empty seats of the U.S. Congress, in the silent departure of Southern senators, and in the hesitant loyalty of border states still weighing their futures. Federal forts and arsenals across the South were seized with minimal resistance, their commanders often sympathetic or simply overwhelmed. Yet Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor remained a stubborn federal outpost, its brick walls standing as the last tangible symbol of a dissolving Union, its garrison rationing supplies under the watchful eyes of Confederate batteries. The human consequences unfolded first in the intimate spaces where people lived and loved. Families divided by the Mason-Dixon line exchanged final letters filled with pleas and accusations, brothers who had once hunted together now choosing opposing uniforms. In the South, enslaved communities stirred with cautious hope, their whispered prayers for freedom growing bolder as rumors of war spread through the quarters on the night wind. Northern cities saw recruitment offices swell with young men eager to preserve the Union, their mothers' tears staining handkerchiefs pressed to trembling lips. Economic panic gripped markets as banks called in loans and merchants hoarded goods, while fear of slave revolts led to nighttime patrols and summary executions on mere suspicion. The social breakdown was not yet battlefield carnage, but it manifested in the erosion of trust between neighbors, in churches splitting along doctrinal lines, and in a collective sense that the familiar world was dissolving into uncertainty. Children played at war with wooden rifles, unaware that the game would soon become grim reality, while elders sat on porches recalling the revolution their grandparents had fought, wondering if this new rupture would birth a different nation or destroy the old one entirely. The long-term historical impact of this pre-war unraveling would reshape not only the American continent but the global balance of power for generations. The war that followed, though still in its embryonic stage as 1861 dawned, would claim more American lives than all other conflicts combined until the 20th century, emancipating 4 million souls while leaving the South in ruins and the North transformed by industrial might. It would cement federal authority over states' rights, accelerate the westward expansion under new terms, and force the nation to confront its founding hypocrisy in ways that echoed through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the civil rights struggles of the next century. The United States that emerged would be forever altered, its identity forged as much in the blood of brother against brother as in the ink of its original Constitution. Yet the seeds of that transformation had been sown long before the first shot, in the compromises and contradictions that defined the Republic's uneasy adolescence. Even now, as the final paragraphs of this era close, one cannot escape the haunting realization that the collapse was never inevitable yet felt, in retrospect, inexorable. The United States before the Civil War stands as a cautionary tableau of a people who believed their union unbreakable until the very moment it began to break. In the quiet fields where cotton once bloomed under the lash, in the empty legislative chambers where debate once rang, and in the hearts of those who chose sides before the first cannon spoke, there lingers a profound silence. A silence not of peace, but of what was lost when ambition outpaced wisdom and division outran compromise. The Republic survived, scarred and remade, but the question it posed to itself and to the world remains etched in history's ledger. How does a nation confront the contradictions at its core before they consume everything it claims to hold dear? The answer, written in the blood and resolve of those who lived it, echoes still across the American landscape, a reminder that even the mightiest experiments in human governance carry within them the quiet potential for irreversible rupture.